The beast had been chained for 300 years. No one remembered who had put the chain there. No one remembered why. The old book said it was a punishment. Some said it was a warning. Others said the beast had done something so terrible that even the gods could not forgive it. But the books were old and the people who wrote them were long dead, and the truth had been buried under centuries of dust and fear. What remained was the clearing. It sat at the edge of the Wethern hills, half a day's walk from the nearest road. The trees around it had stopped growing long ago. The grass was grey and thin. The air smelled of cold stone and something old, something that made animals turn and run without knowing why. No bird flew over it. No fox crossed through it. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. At the center of the clearing stood the ruins of a fortress. Most of it had fallen. Great blocks of black stone tumbled over each other like broken teeth. Moss had swallowed the lower walls. Vines had pulled apart what the years had not. And there, in the middle of the ruin, where the largest stone still stood in a rough circle, the beast sat chained. It was enormous. Its body was long and heavy, covered in scales the color of ash and old iron. Its wings were folded tight against its sides, the joints stiff from years of stillness. Its neck was thick as an old oak, and its head, when it lifted, was broad and angular with eyes that burned a dull amber even in daylight. The chain was thick iron, dark with age, wrapped in several loops around a massive stone anchor sunk deep into the ground. The beast could stand. It could pace a short circle. It could lift its head and scream. And it did scream. Every time someone came near, the sound it made was not a roar. It was something worse. It was a sound full of pain so old it had turned into something sharp and furious. Warriors who had walked into 100 battles said afterward that the sound reached inside them and pulled at something soft. Most turned and ran before they even saw the beast clearly. Those who stayed longer came back pale and quiet and did not speak of what they had felt. Over 3 centuries, no one had made it closer than 40 paces. The kingdoms had stopped trying. The beast became a place on a map with a warning mark. Travelers rerouted. Merchants paid extra to use the long road around the hills. Children were told not to go near the Wethern ruins. Most of them listened. Hal had not grown up hearing those stories. He had grown up in a small river town far to the east, the youngest son of a man who made boots. He had no interest in boots. He had interest in roads and distances and the shapes of hills and the way rivers bent around rock. By the time he was 23, he had taught himself cartography from borrowed books and had walked more roads than most men twice his age. He worked alone. He was quiet and steady and comfortable with long silences. He was also, on this particular afternoon, completely lost. His map of the Wethern Hills region was old and poorly made by someone who had clearly never visited. 3 of the roads on it did not exist. One road that did exist was not on it at all. Hal had been following that road for 2 hours before it curved unexpectedly north and ended at a narrow gap between 2 hillsides. He pushed through the gap and found himself standing at the edge of a wide, dead clearing. He stopped. He looked at the ruins. He looked at the gray grass and the still air and the heavy silence that sat over everything. He saw the shape in the center of the clearing. The enormous, motionless shape with its folded wings and its lowered head and its chain. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked forward, chose a flat-topped stone about 30 paces from the ruins, sat down, opened his pack, and took out his bread and dried meat. He ate slowly. He looked at his ruined map. He made a note in the margin about the road. He looked up once at the beast, which had lifted its head and was watching him with amber eyes that were sharp and unreadable. Hal looked back down at his notes. He finished his food. He drank from his water skin. He decided he would camp here for the night since the light was already going thin and the next village was too far. He did not feel afraid. He was not sure why. He simply did not. The beast watched him until dark and did not make a sound. Hal came back the next morning. He had slept against the base of a fallen wall, wrapped in his traveling blanket, and woken up to gray sky and cold air. The beast had not moved in the night. It was still sitting in the same position, head low, eyes open, watching. Hal looked at it briefly, nodded once as if greeting a neighbor, and then started a small fire to warm his hands. He made no sudden movements. He did not stare. He simply went about his morning the way he always did, slowly, quietly, without fuss. He had work to do anyway. The Wethern Hills region was one of the least mapped areas in the Eastern Territories. His employer, a trade guild in the city of Arnfeld, wanted accurate distances between the hill passes and the river crossings to the south. It was detailed, careful work that required walking, measuring, and a great deal of sitting still with a pencil. Hal was good at all three. So he worked. He spent the first day mapping the outer edge of the clearing and the shape of the ruined walls. He moved slowly and kept to the far side, never crossing within 25 paces of the beast. He did not talk. He did not make loud noises. When he needed to move closer to sketch a section of the fallen stone, he did it gradually, pausing between each step, giving the beast time to adjust to where he was. The beast watched him the entire time. It did not scream. It did not lunge. It sat with its heavy head turned in Hal's direction and followed him with those amber eyes the way a cat watches something it has not yet decided about. Hal noticed this but said nothing about it. He simply continued working. On the second day he came back and did the same. On the third day it rained. Hal sat under a section of intact wall with his hood up and his notebook open, sketching from memory and making distance calculations. The beast pulled its wings slightly tighter against its body in the rain. Hal watched that small movement from the corner of his eye and said nothing. But he noted it. The wings moved. Which meant they were not completely stiff. Which meant the beast was not as broken as it looked. He filed that thought away and went back to his numbers. On the fourth day the rain had stopped and the air was clean and cold. Hal walked the full perimeter of the ruins, measuring carefully. At one point his path took him within 15 paces of the chain anchor, closer than he had been before. He felt the beast go very still as he approached. Not tense in an aggressive way. Tense the way a creature goes still when it is waiting to see what happens next. Hal measured his distance, wrote it down, and walked back the way he came. The beast slowly relaxed. On the fifth day Hal did something different. He made his small fire, cooked his morning meal, and ate most of it as usual. But when he was done he took a portion, a piece of dried meat and half of a thick grain biscuit, and he walked to a flat stone that sat roughly halfway between his usual spot and the edge of the ruins. He set the food down on the stone carefully. He did not look at the beast while he did it. He did not say anything. He simply placed the food, straightened up, and walked back to his seat and opened his notebook. He did not look up for the rest of the afternoon. The beast did not move toward the food while Hal was awake. He did not expect it to. He packed up his things at dusk, settled into his sleeping spot, and closed his eyes. He woke once in the deep of the night. The clearing was very quiet. There was no wind. The stars were out and the ruins were pale shapes in the darkness. Hal lay still and listened. He could hear, faintly, the sound of the chain shifting. A slow and careful movement. Then stillness again. Then the faint sound of something being taken from stone. He did not open his eyes all the way. He did not move. In the morning the food was gone. Hal looked at the empty stone for a moment. Then he looked at the beast. It was not watching him. Its great head was resting on the ground, eyes closed, breathing slow and deep. It was sleeping. Hal sat down, opened his pack, and started his breakfast. He worked quietly that whole morning and did not make a single unnecessary sound. Some things, he understood, needed to be protected while they lasted. 2 weeks passed quietly. Hal had settled into a simple routine. He woke early, made his fire, ate, and worked. He left food on the flat stone every morning without making a show of it. He moved around the ruins carefully and slowly. He never pushed closer than he had the day before. He never made sudden sounds. He never stared too long. The beast had changed too, though slowly. It no longer watched Hal with that tight, ready stillness it had kept in the first few days. Its body had loosened somewhat. Its wings, which it had kept pressed flat and rigid, now rested in a more natural position. It still watched him. It always watched him. But the watching felt different now. Less like suspicion. More like something that had no good name yet. It ate the food every night. On the 9th day it had moved to the halfway stone while Hal was still awake, though it waited until his back was turned. On the 11th day it ate while he was sitting quietly nearby, head down over his notebook. On the 13th day it ate while he watched openly, and neither of them made anything of it. That evening Hal sat by his small fire and looked at the beast for a long time. He had been thinking about something for several days. He was not a doctor. He was not a soldier or a scholar or a beast handler. He was a cartographer who was good at being still and patient and paying attention. And what he had been paying attention to, slowly and carefully, was the way the beast moved. Or rather, the way it did not move. It never shifted its body fully. It changed the position of its head and neck often enough. It adjusted its wings. But its lower body, from the mid-section down to where the chain met its body, stayed in the same position almost always. When it did move that part of itself, it did so with a slowness that was not laziness. It was the slowness of something that hurt. Hal had seen that kind of movement before. In people. In an old man in his hometown who had a wound in his side that never healed right and spent 30 years moving carefully around the pain of it. In a horse he had once helped on a road that had a stone deep in its hoof that the owner had not noticed. Things in pain moved around the pain without knowing they were doing it. He looked at the chain. Everyone assumed the chain was around the beast's neck or leg. That was what the old book said. But from where Hal sat, the chain did not go to the neck. It went lower. To the side. To a place that the beast kept turned slightly away from the world. That night Hal made a decision. The next morning he did his usual routine. Fire. Food. Stone. Notebook. He worked through the morning without looking up much. Around midday he set his notebook down, rested his hands on his knees, and looked at the beast directly. The beast looked back. Hal spoke for the first time in 2 weeks. His voice was quiet and even, the way he would speak to a person sitting across a table. He asked where it hurt. The clearing was completely silent after that. No wind. No birds. Just the question sitting in the air between them. The beast was still for a long time. Its amber eyes were steady on his face. Hal did not look away and did not add anything to what he had said. He simply waited the way he had learned to wait, without pressure, without expectation, just open and present. Then the beast moved. It was slow. It was clearly painful. It shifted its great body by degrees, pulling its weight to one side, and as it did the truth of 300 years came into view. The chain did not end at a collar or a cuff or a ring around a limb. It ended in the beast's side. The iron had been driven in and the flesh had grown around it over centuries, layer upon layer of scale and hardened skin sealing over something that had never been removed. The wound was old and discolored and the skin around it was pulled tight and wrong. It had been hurting every single day for 300 years. Hal looked at it for a long time without speaking. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He took in every detail carefully and quietly the way he took in the details of roads and hills and river bends. Then he looked up at the beast's face. He said quietly that he would need to get some things. The beast lowered its head slowly and watched him begin to pack his bag. Hal was gone for 4 days. The nearest town with a proper supply trader was 2 days' walk from the Wethern Hills. He moved fast and did not stop longer than he needed to. He knew what he required and he went through the trader's stock carefully and without rushing. Medicines for deep old wounds. Clean cloth in large quantities. Strong metal cutting tools. A small iron hand saw. Bottles of clear antiseptic that smelled sharp and clean. Needles and heavy thread. The trader asked no questions. Hal paid and left. He also stopped at the home of Pete, an old friend who had spent 12 years as a field medic with the border army before his knees gave out and he retired to a quiet life growing vegetables outside town. Pete was broad and calm and had seen enough bad wounds in his life that very little surprised him anymore. Hal explained the situation plainly and without decoration. Pete listened. Then he said give him 10 minutes to get his bag. The third member was Pete's neighbor Nora, who had assisted the town's doctor for 8 years and had hands that were steady and precise in the way that only came from long practice. She was practical and quiet, and when Pete told her what they were walking into she asked only 2 questions. How old was the wound and how large was the creature? Hal answered both. She packed her own bag and joined them without further comment. The 3 of them reached the clearing on the morning of the 4th day. Pete and Nora stopped at the tree line. The beast was sitting in its usual position, head up, watching the gap in the trees. When Hal stepped through it lowered its head slightly in a way that Pete later said he would not have believed if he had not seen it himself. Hal walked forward. He spoke to the beast quietly, telling it who Pete and Nora were and why they had come. He did not know how much the beast understood of human words. But it had understood where does it hurt, and that was enough for him. He waved Pete and Nora forward slowly. They came in carefully, following Hal's lead, keeping their movements small and unhurried. The beast watched them with sharp eyes. Its body was tense. But it did not scream. It did not lunge. It held itself still with a visible effort that Hal understood now was not aggression but endurance. They set their bags down and got to work. The first day was preparation only. Pete examined the wound from a careful distance at first, then closer as the beast allowed it. The chain was thick and the entry point was surrounded by layers of toughened skin and old scarring. Pete said nothing dramatic about what he saw. He simply sat back, thought for a while, and began explaining to Nora what they would need to do and in what order. That night they camped at the edge of the clearing and spoke in low voices about the plan. The second day they began cleaning the outer wound. Nora worked with slow and deliberate care, her hands steady, her movements gentle. The beast flinched once at the first touch and went completely rigid. Everyone stopped. Hal sat close and kept talking in a low even voice about nothing in particular, the road he had walked, the shape of the hills, the way the river looked in the early morning. After a while the beast's breathing slowed. Nora continued. They worked in shifts through the second and third days. The cleaning alone took hours. The wound was deep and had never drained properly in 3 centuries. Pete worked on the sections that required more strength and Nora handled the careful detailed work around the chain itself. Hal stayed near the beast's head the entire time, talking when it seemed needed and staying quiet when quiet was better. On the 4th day Pete picked up the iron cutting tool. It took most of the morning. The chain was old but still strong and the angle was difficult. Pete worked steadily without stopping. Nora kept the area clean as he worked. Hal did not move from his spot near the beast's head. When the chain finally came free the sound it made hitting the ground was heavy and dull. The beast made no sound at all. It stayed completely still for a long moment. Then, very slowly, it lowered its great head down to the dirt. Not in pain. Not in defeat. In the way that something does when it has been holding itself up for longer than should be possible and has finally, completely, been allowed to stop. Its eyes closed. Hal sat down beside it in the dirt, his back against its jaw, his legs stretched out in front of him. Pete and Nora sat nearby and nobody said anything. The beast breathed slowly and deeply and slept. Hal sat in the quiet and felt nothing but tired and grateful and completely at peace. The beast slept for 2 full days. Hal, Pete, and Nora stayed nearby. They kept the fire small and their voices low and let the creature rest without interruption. Pete changed the dressing on the wound once, carefully, while the beast was still half asleep. It stirred but did not wake fully. Nora cleaned their tools and repacked the bags. Hal worked on his maps and said very little. On the morning of the 3rd day the beast opened its eyes. It lifted its head slowly, the way something does when it is testing whether the pain is still there. It moved its neck. It shifted its body. Then it did something that made Pete go very still and Nora set down what she was holding. It stood up. All the way up, on all 4 legs, to its full height, for the first time in 300 years. It stood there in the pale morning light and simply breathed. Hal looked up from his notebook and watched. He did not say anything. He just watched the beast stand in the open air of the clearing, unchained, unhurt, and alive in a way it had not been in centuries. Then he looked back down at his map and kept working. Pete leaned over to Nora and said quietly that he thought he understood now why Hal had not been afraid. A few days later Pete and Nora returned home. Hal stayed. He still had work to finish in the Wethern Hills region and the clearing was as good a camp as any. That was what he told himself. The truth was simpler. He was not ready to leave and the beast was not ready to be left and both of them seemed to understand this without it needing to be said. The beast began to move beyond the clearing for the first time. It went slowly at first. Short distances. It would walk to the tree line and stop and look out at the land beyond and then return to the clearing where Hal was working. Then it began going a little further. An hour away. Half a day. But it always came back before dark and settled near the ruins where Hal had his fire going and his notes spread out on the flat stone. Something else began to happen too. Where the beast walked the ground changed. It was subtle at first. A thin line of green appearing in gray grass. A small plant pushing through cracked dry earth in a place where nothing had grown in years. Then more. Slowly, steadily, the dead land around the Wethern Hills began to wake up. Moss returned to the lower stones. Thin grass spread across the clearing floor. A single tree at the edge of the ruins put out new leaves. No one could explain it. Pete wrote a letter about it to an old army colleague who knew about such things. The colleague wrote back with 3 different theories and no conclusions. Hal noted the changes in his maps and records without offering any opinion. Word spread the way word always spreads. Slowly at first, then all at once. A trader mentioned it to a merchant. The merchant mentioned it to a courier. The courier carried the story to the next town and the next. Within 2 months the story had reached 4 kingdoms. The chained beast of the Wethern ruins was free. It was walking the dead lands. Things were growing where it walked. And the young cartographer was camped nearby, completely unharmed. The reactions came quickly after that. One kingdom sent 6 soldiers to assess the threat. The beast looked at them from across the clearing and then walked away into the trees. The soldiers stood around for a while and then left. Another kingdom sent 2 scholars with notebooks and measuring tools. The beast ignored them completely. They wrote a great deal down and understood very little of it. A third kingdom sent a lord with a formal letter demanding to know who had released the creature and by what authority. Hal read the letter politely and said he was just a cartographer. The lord left unsatisfied. Through all of it the beast stayed close to Hal. Not in an aggressive way. Not as a guard or a weapon. Simply close, the way something stays near the place where it first felt safe. When Hal packed up and moved to a new section of the hills the beast followed at its own pace and was always there by evening. The kingdoms eventually stopped sending people. The scholars wrote their papers. The soldiers filed their reports. The lords moved on to other concerns. The land around the Wethern hills continued slowly, quietly coming back to life. And in the middle of all of it Hal finished his maps. He sat one evening by his fire with the last page complete, looking out at the clearing that was no longer grey and dead but touched now with green and the sound of small things living in the grass. The beast was resting nearby, its great side rising and falling in the firelight. The world had spent 300 years afraid of the wrong thing entirely. It was never the beast that was the danger. It was only ever the silence that no one had been willing to break.